introduction. So I'm interested in my work in trying to understand how we think about fundamental concepts like the idea of a person and how we can have subtle but impactful biases embedded in how we think about those concepts that don't really feel like we're being biased or sexist necessarily, but nevertheless are evident and shape how we make decisions. So, as Madeline mentioned, there is evidence that when we think of a person, we tend to think of a man more than a woman. And that on its own is, to me, really interesting because there's men and women are about half the population alongside people of other gender identities. So there's no kind of frequency based reason for us to have this bias. And this matters because there's all kinds of contexts where we want to be serving generic people and have that include men and women to the same degree. But if men are prioritized, we're kind of subtly prioritizing men in those contexts as well, so not just in our concepts.
Welcome to PPLS Perspectives, a podcast bringing students and academics together to explore the research carried out by the University of Edinburgh School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences and the impact this work has on society.
Welcome to another episode of the PPLS Perspectives podcast. My name is Madeline Horner. I'm a second year PhD in psychology here at the University of Edinburgh, and my research focus is mostly on social cognition. I'm really interested in empathy and how we evaluate how much other people care about us. I'm not April's PhD student, but I do some work with April on blame, judgments, and gender. And that's not the focus today. The focus is April. April is a newer lecturer here in psychology. She does social psychology more broadly, and her work focuses on beliefs about gender, social identities, and groups. Methodologically, she's interested in mostly quantitative methods from social psychology and social cognition. She's been doing some more stuff in computational linguistics and natural language processing. Most recently, she leads the Bailey Identity and Social Cognition Lab, and here at University of Edinburgh, she co-leads the Mind and Gender Lab, and recently she's been named the 2026 Early Career Award for the International Social Cognition Network. So am I saying that correctly? But in the past, she's also been named 2024 an APS Rising Star for early career researchers. Her research has been featured in popular outlets such as Scientific American and Psychology Today. So she's got quite a catalog and accolades. But today in this episode, we're going to be talking about gender and more specifically her work on our tendency to think of generics person as man rather than woman. For our episode today, the structure is 5 questions. We start with an elevator pitch of your research, April. And so just like a brief explanation of your research, under 2 minutes around, go.
Great. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm interested in my work in trying to understand how we think about fundamental concepts like the idea of a person and how we can have subtle but impactful biases embedded in how we think about those concepts that don't really feel like we're being biased or sexist necessarily, but nevertheless are evident and shape how we make decisions. So as Madeline mentioned, there is evidence that when we think of a person, we tend to think of a man more than a woman. And that on its own is, to me, really interesting because there's men and women are about half the population alongside people of other gender identities. So there's no kind of frequency-based reason for us to have this bias. And this matters because there's all kinds of contexts where we want to be serving generic people and have that include men and women to the same degree. But if men are prioritized, we're kind of subtly prioritizing men in those contexts as well, so not just in our concepts. And as Madeline mentioned, I take a social cognitive approach to this. This is kind of a jargony term, but what it means is that I'm interested in how the mind works and how we represent basic things like categories, and trying to understand how that interfaces with social information, in this case, our gender.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a good synopsis. So yeah, you've been doing this kind of like line of thinking and research for like a few years now, about, yeah. So what kind of got you inspired to carry out this research?
That's such a great question. I was initially inspired to do this because I noticed this way of thinking in myself. And I'm a woman, so you would think that, and I care about gender equity and gender egalitarianism. So you would think that I would have those values reflected in my ideas as well. But I started to notice that when I was thinking of a person, that I often had men coming to mind. And I wanted to understand that more and understand it and document it in an empirical way to precisely see what is this phenomenon, how can we measure it, and also what are the implications of this way of thinking for other types of judgments that we might make.
Yeah, yeah. I guess like anecdotally, I find myself often reading a research paper where it just has last names, and I assume they're men more than women. And I guess that could be also a product of being in a more male dominated field, that I just have this like innate bias. But I'm always surprised. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's a woman once I like read the first names. And I was like, oh gosh, I like do have, I find myself having that bias even in just quite like a normative sense that like I have like every day. So yeah, it's not something like to take for granted, even if you have certain ideals or whatnot about gender. So yeah, as I mentioned before, you've done some stuff with natural language processing most recently, and you do a lot of like experimental design and empirical studies. What are some like methodologies that I guess you're kind of like leaning towards doing this more like linguistic approach to things, which makes a lot of sense when you're talking about generics and gender. But yeah, can you take us through a bit of the process of how you've been conducting your research thus far?
That's right. So there's a few ways that we've shown this in our research, and I'll just name a couple of them to give you a sense of the different types of evidence that we have and methods that we use. So I think the most intuitive one is what I call the think of a person task. So we just prompt participants to think of a person. And to make sure they're thinking of someone concrete, we'll say, give this person a name, maybe jot down a couple hobbies that they have. And then later in the survey, we ask them a bunch of questions about the person they came up with. So if I came up with someone named Madeline, later in the survey, it would be like, what is Madeline's age? Is Madeline a student? And included in that is, what is Madeline's gender? And this is a really intuitive measure because it captures just who pops to mind. Some other measures we've used like speeded response time tasks where people have to rapidly categorize different stimuli, and drawing on decades of work in cognitive psychology, people are faster to categorize things together when they are already connected in their minds. So there's like this facilitation effect. So we've shown both that people associate the concepts like person, people, individual with men more than women. And we've also shown the kind of what I see as the flip side of this, which is that people tend to think of men as people and they think of people as men. So there's this bidirectional relationship. And then when people are thinking about women, it's not that they necessarily don't think of them as people or dehumanize them. There's a whole separate literatures on dehumanization, but rather that people think of women as women. So we've also shown that, so that if you prompt people with gender concepts, that activates women more than men. And then in our linguistic analysis, we've also looked at this. So modern machine learning tools are able to capture what words mean based on kind of eating a bunch of text on the internet and keeping track of systematic regularities in where different words appear alongside other words. These machines can quantify semantics. And this is really exciting because when I ask you what a word means, you can get a response from a human participant, but this is a way of precisely mathematically quantifying meaning just based on large scale co-occurrences. So using this technique, we've shown that people use words like people, person, individual more interchangeably with words like man, male, he, suggesting that these things mean something more similar to each other. So based on billions of words on the internet, we can see that in this really large scale context, when people are talking about people, they kind of mean men a lot, at least more than they mean women. And then again, we've also shown that in the converse of that, which is that when people talk about women, female, females, woman, all of that is more similar in semantic space to names that are common among women. Whereas for names that are common among men, they're not as gendered. So they're not as connected to gender specific concepts like man and males.
Cool. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So like, yeah, I guess because you've done these like different methodologies throughout, like, are there certain challenges you've had doing this research? I guess in terms of like design, methodology, as well as just like principally, I guess there's probably like a lot of pushback against gendered research and whatnot in certain respects. So yeah, can you walk us through some of the challenges you've had when conducting this research?
One of the challenges that we have that I think about a lot is how to think about what types of women and what types of men are we talking about. So in the same way that we can kind of default to thinking of a person as a man, we have lots of other default biases too when we're thinking about social categories. So in my work and other people's work, there's also evidence that, for instance, we default, and at least in certain samples, that we also have kind of a white-centric bias, and we default to thinking of white people. And I think this, I'm naming this because I think this actually is a challenge, because when we're trying to understand how different identities intersect, that is sometimes easier to do depending on our methods, but it's sometimes harder to do.
Yeah, I guess people hold many identities.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. To look at many categories, and gender is more embedded in language than other social identities. And so sometimes it's challenging to look at multiple things at once, whereas we have lots of terms, at least in English, but this is true in many other languages as well. We have lots of terms that denote like a woman and a man, but less terms that denote other types, like how old is that woman and how old is, we don't have as much for these kind of intersectional identities.
Yeah. So how do you kind of like, when you're designing these experiments, how do you control for this like intersection between all these different identities that people hold to really like get at the core of your research questions?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Like if you've got like all these different like social identities that people hold at once, and you're really interested in these like biases that people have regarding gender, how are you able to kind of control for all of these other things that are co-occurring at the same time?
These other like intersecting identities.
Yeah.
So I think one way that we have done it is looking at first names, because first names do encode. Obviously, if you know someone's first name, you don't necessarily know their gender or their race or their ethnicity. But there are regularities in which types of people tend to have certain types of names. So we were able to look at gender and race ethnicity intersections using first names, and based on this large data set of over 4,000 first names, where we had millions of people with those names self-identifying as a different gender and also race and ethnicity. And that was a cool data set because it took us a while to find, but allowed us to not just say, oh, this is a stereotypically white man's name, but rather precisely say someone with this name has a high probability of being a white man based on this large data set of just lots of folks with those names. So that's one way that we've gotten, that we have done it. But I think there are other methods that kind of don't lend themselves to this very well. I think that we as a kind of broader field, this is something that we should continue to be thinking about and be more precise about, because this is a way in which our science can be kind of subtly oriented around men, white people, without us even realizing it.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of our methods, we encountered this in Madeline and I's own research that we're doing together as a project, that a lot of work focuses on just one type of person, but isn't necessarily explicit about that. But their methods will, like in their materials, that the survey that a participant might complete, it either is only asking questions about men explicitly or implicitly. It's just asking questions about people. But as we know, based on my research, when people are asking questions about people, who's coming to mind, it's not neutral.
And
so I think that this is like something that comes up in my work and something I need to be more mindful of, but also is kind of more a broader issue in any type of research that we do.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you're using these like data sets. So you're using secondary data as well as like primary data collection in your work then?
That's right. Yeah. So for that project with the names, we had access to, it was like a published data set. It was originally, actually, this is just an interesting aside. It was originally like mortgage applications. That's
Oh,
how
really?
it was like self-identified. And, you know, but this also is a challenge because that immediately brings up questions about class, who is even applying for a mortgage. That's not evenly distributed across different types of people. And so like who's even in that data set to begin with. But it gave us like a data-driven way to make
Right.
inferences about the names.
Yeah, I guess there's kind of that like old adage of there's biases like all the way down.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, but even within the secondary data set, the people that are
Yeah.
included in it are a
And this is the
subset of
problem too
yeah.
with the text-based analyses. Like one of the ways, so I often also collect data from like human participants. So maybe I'll get like 300 participants or 1,000 participants to complete my task. And you do have sampling biases there about who's included. And the text-based analysis is kind of nice because you're working with large scale, billions of words on the internet. And I think it was a mistake to think that that's also totally solving this problem.
Right.
Because just if you have sampling bias, the fact that the sample's big doesn't make that go away. And so we know, for instance, that about 51% of text on the internet is in English, but that does not reflect humanity and the number of like different languages that are spoken around the world.
Yeah.
And so lots of what we know about language, lots of what these modern machine learning algorithms know about language is all based on English, mostly based on English.
So you're collecting data off, or you're getting the secondary data off the internet. Are you like scraping data from certain platforms, or is this just like
yeah? So in my
occurring?
published work, I have not myself scraped.
Yeah.
So I've used pre-trained models that have been trained on large scrapings of the internet.
Okay, so you're taking the scrapings of the person that has already. You're taking the scrape data that somebody else has already scraped off of the internet.
That's right.
Okay.
And I'm even doing something simpler than that, which is I'm also then using the output of algorithms that have other people have trained based on the scraping.
Yeah.
But we also do sometimes do our own scraping depending on the research question. So I'm working with a student now, Faisal, who is interested in gendered language in policy documents. And so he's been working to access policy documents in this European corpus of all EU laws. And he's worked, took quite a lot of time for him and really reflected his skill in accessing those documents. We have them now so that then we can process them in a systematic, quantitative way to understand how are people talking about gender in policies.
Right.
And there we find, this is like ongoing work, but we are seeing some initial evidence that when people write policies, they write them in one way. And then when people write policies that are about women, they write them in a different way. And so the policies that include more language about women in them are more different than policies that include language that doesn't have gender mentioned or language about men specifically.
Right.
Suggesting another way in which instead of being given equal weight, there is a kind of squishing into a corner that it happens a little bit more for when we think about and write about women than men.
So even though like all of this, like Faisal's work, you've got like a bunch of stuff you've scraped across like a larger time period, it sounds like this field of research is just like quite dynamic inherently, that things are always changing in terms of like how we're viewing things. You've got like what's politically correct or incorrect and how stuff is changing over time. So how do you see that reflected like in your research? Because it's just, yeah, inherently kind of a dynamic topic to be thinking about.
It is. Yeah. And I think one like clear way in which we see this is I do think about like terms a lot, and that's relevant to because I'm interested in how people think. And one of the way that how they think is reflected in their language. But then as Madeline's pointing out, there's also these more like top-down forces. And so a good example of this is like the epicene pronoun use. So this is the pronoun that might be used to refer to someone of any and unknown gender. And so in everyday speech, people use the word they. So if a student wants to do well, they should study hard. And that was very common up until about the turn of the 20th century. And then there was kind of these top-down efforts from probably people like me, the equivalent of me at the time. So
Yeah.
academics were encouraging people to use he. And then that became very common to use he. If a student wants to do well, he should study hard. This is interesting, though, because I think it also reflects it was at the time considered more correct to do that because you have this singular match now between he and student, singular pronoun, whereas that was the problem with they.
Right.
But this has really changed over even our lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think you now see it's much more common to use they again, or people will use he and she, or they'll just use she. I've also seen that quite a lot more. So I'm interested in, I haven't done this in my work, but I am just kind of broadly interested in the impact of these more broad societal shifts, and sometimes top down. Sometimes people are told like it's not okay to use they because of the singular plural disagreement.
Right.
Or it's not okay to use he because it is prioritizing men. So you get these kind of top down messages, and then how does that feedback and shape people's representation of just the generic person concept?
Yeah, I guess that makes me question, like, is there a true generic if like how we've been talking about things has always held some other identity within it, like he being, male, or they is also now an identity if you're non-binary. So yeah, is there even such a thing as like a gender neutral
I think
word
this is
at this
such a great
point?
question. Is there such a thing as gender neutral? And I remember I've talked to, yeah, I guess I would say no, because I think gender is such a fundamental way that we understand ourselves and our world. And so we tend, we automatically recognize we make a guess about someone's gender automatically within a couple hundred milliseconds of seeing them. Of course, that guess is not always right. Sometimes we make a guess about someone's gender and then we talk to them and learn what their gender is, and we were wrong. But we're doing that all the time. And it is almost, there's other work, this is not my own work, but it's like people can't interact with someone if they don't know their gender. They have to they don't know how to even engage in that conversation if it's like an online conversation, for instance. And you'll see evidence for this right throughout online spaces that are an interesting case where you can interact without signaling an identity.
Yeah.
But there's so many conventions where people do signal their identity.
Right.
One of the things that Madeline and I are working on in the context of the work she mentioned on morality and blame judgments is we're interested in kind of the am I the jerk post
on Reddit
that you have on Reddit. And this format has such a formula to it, and part of that formula is that you indicate the gender of all the actors involved.
Yeah.
And it's almost like people cannot reason about the moral implications of someone's actions if they don't know their gender. So in many ways, I think, yes, of course, as you mentioned, the word they, sometimes people who are gender non-binary or have other gender expansive identity will use the word they to signal that.
Right.
But even there's lots of work that when people are interacting with people who are gender non-binary, especially general samples, they really struggle to even have that expansive representation.
Yeah.
And even if they're honoring that person's identity, they tend to still think about them in binary terms as either a man or a woman.
Yeah. So you're saying people like have some initial judgment fairly quickly upon meeting somebody, and I know from some of your work you've used like the implicit association test. So I guess that's like kind of one way of trying to capture how quickly people are making these associations. Can you talk a little bit more about your work that you've done using that specifically?
Yeah, that's right. And so in that task, this is a very influential task in social cognition, but is based on just really classic ideas from cognitive psychology, which is that concepts that are connected prime each other and make it easier to quickly identify them. So how this task works is you see a word on the center of your screen and you have to rapidly classify it as belonging to one of 4 categories. But the trick is that those 4 categories are themselves visually arranged as either 2 on the left or 2 on the right. And so when you see a single word, you press one of 2 keys to categorize it. So I might see a name like April, which is a typically female name, and classify it with a right-hand key press as a female name. And then I see a word like person. And sometimes the task requires me to classify person with a right-hand key press as well, also with alongside all the female names. And sometimes it requires me to classify it with a left-hand key press different from the female names. And I'm giving you a simplified picture, but what we find is that people are faster and make fewer errors when they're classifying two sets of stimuli, like male names and person words, together with the same key press than when they have to do female names and person words. And so this is one way that we can measure this. And what's nice about this measure is it's certainly people are aware that they're doing it. And also there's some evidence that they have a good guess about what their representation is. So it's not totally unconscious or anything like that, but it's hard for people to control. And so we can measure what they're thinking without them, maybe they think of a man, but then they think, oh, I don't want to do that because I'm a woman, or I want to be more gender egalitarian. So they change their response. And with this task, it's impossible to do that, or very hard to do that.
Yeah, because it's quite rapid. So these are like in-person things that
I have done that task in person, but I also often do it online.
Okay.
And you can, as you know, I think it's data collection like this with response times is noisier online.
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with people's refresh rates and stuff.
Right.
I feel like we're very in the weeds. But you can do it online. You just need a larger sample to get a reliable estimate.
And you were saying, like, mostly you've had, there's some biases in sampling where it's that most of your work has been done within like a Western context.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I did my training in the States before I came here to Scotland. And so most of the samples that I've worked with are American samples or now some UK samples. But we all felt in ongoing work, we are starting to look at this outside of a US context. So we have some samples using some of these same tasks that I've talked about today from Spanish-speaking contexts in Mexico and in Spain, and then also from Chinese-speaking contexts, so in China. And there we're trying to understand whether this bias is present in different cultural contexts. There's also some really exciting work that I'm involved in that's being led by a student, Xiaolin Zhao. And she has collected data from this really interesting cultural context, which is a minority matrilineal Masu community in China. And they have a really different gender structure in terms of power and control of the household and control of the economics of the household. And she's collected data trying to understand whether they show the same way of thinking and also how that changes across the lifespan. So looking at children and adolescents and adults. And I think this is important work to help us understand how this specific kind of male generic, male default interfaces with other forms of gender hierarchy.
Cool. Yeah. So you feel like outside of everything you've looked at within like a Western context, you feel like there's like implications beyond that, or your work translates into these like other cultural contexts as well? Are you like does it like expand beyond just this like Western context into these other like cultural contexts, these phenomena that you're describing? Or in some of these maybe like matrilineal societies, do you expect like an inverse of the findings you've been?
Yeah, that's right. So we do think and we are finding that the pattern is quite a bit different in a matrilineal context. And there we almost see, this work has been submitted but has not been published yet, but there we see a more symmetrical pattern where men think of men and women think of women. And that's also what we see among children as well. So people tend to kind of anchor on their own identities. And this is very different than what we see in many, at this point now, Western samples. I will say as well that we're also really interested in the role of language, as we were talking about. That is this particularly pronounced in an English-speaking context where you have this historic use of he as this generic.
Right.
And in other language contexts where that's less common, or where you see even, so where that's less common, so you have a genderless language like Turkish or Finnish, where they don't have gender pronouns, they don't have this kind of like generic he that we have in English. Or conversely, in other languages where everything is gendered, male, female, all the time, that might reinforce certain types of gender biases, like thinking of men as really essentially different from each other. but actually undermine this bias that we're talking about today, because it kind of, you're constantly reminded just from the language about men and women. It's always both of these things. And so this is, I think we don't know the answer fully yet, because this is ongoing work, and there's just more that we need to do as many fields of psychology, to get beyond this Western focus that we have, and to try to understand this more holistically.
Yeah. So you've talked about like a few different ways that our biases can like play into, or where they can come from or stem from. So you've talked about, you've got these like power hierarchies. So in Western context, it's very male centered, or even like linguistically, you have these like gendered languages and whatnot. Are there other like roots of where you think our biases might stem from outside of just language and social hierarchies?
I think what is causing this definitively, we do not know. Yeah.
Right.
So I do have various thoughts. So it does seem like the culture that you're raised in is relevant based on this emerging, not yet published, matrilineal sample that's very informative. And also across different age groups. I think that also really helps us understand, because it seems like young children default to thinking of their own gender. And this is consistent with young kids are really into their own gender group and go through this period of gender intensification where all girls want to do all things girls and boys want to do all things boys.
Right.
And so this is consistent with that. But then what we are seeing with the age grouping is that kind of gradually disappears for girls, whereas for boys, it just remains constant. And so I think that is telling us that this is learned, but then I think we have questions about how do they learn it? So there could be features of language, like we mentioned. There's also ways in which our kind of society probably reinforces this. So there's lots of evidence that at least Western media vastly overrepresents men, wherever you look. So if you look at video games or magazines or books, there's just way more male protagonists than there are female protagonists. And as children are consuming this culture, they might learn about whose stories are most important and are featured most often. So that's, I think, one mechanism through which we learn this. I think another one, which is related, is just about, and this is very related, is about kind of the size of the categories that we're talking about. So gender is an interesting case because you do have about the same number of men and women in the world. Whereas with some of the ways in which we default to thinking of certain types of people, although it might have some of the same harms as in the gender case, it makes a little bit more sense to me just from a frequency-based explanation.
Right.
So, we tend to think of a person as straight. Queer people are a statistical minority in the population. So if we just think about how we represent categories, we tend to represent categories based on things that we see a lot of. And that's true for non-social categories too. Like when you're thinking about, a chair, but many of you will have an idea of a chair in mind right now that's
Right.
similar to each other. And it's because you've seen lots of chairs that look like that. And so what's going on in the case of men and women, because you don't quite have that explanation to pull on. But I think media could be playing a large role in this, given that although men and women are equal in the population, that's not true in terms of they're not equal in what we're consuming.
And their representation within
Yeah.
Okay, so your lab also looks at other social identities outside of just gender and whatnot in terms of male and female. What other like interests you have in other like gender identities? Are you doing any research looking beyond the binary?
Yeah, so we are interested so a lot of what we've been talking about today has just been about men and women and that binary context, which again is a big one. But we're also interested in how people think about people who don't fall within that binary and whether or not and when are they thinking of them. And we're also interested in sampling from people who themselves are not in the binary. So how do people whose own gender identity is not man or woman, but is something else, how do they think about these things? And so we're interested in trying to understand that as well, because I think that's an important part of fully understanding how humans think, is to try to capture that breadth. And then, yeah, one of my PhD students, Trish Perkins, works a lot across different social identities to try to understand how some of these same processes might emerge when we're thinking about sexual orientation groups, when we're thinking about racial groups, when we're thinking about body size groups, and how obviously I'm talking about these as if they're separable dimensions, but of course they also intersect.
Right.
And so Trish is trying to understand when do we prioritize one groups over another, and by looking across categories is also helping us to understand where this is coming from.
Yeah.
Because these different identity dimensions differ in the size of the relative categories and also how much different groups are stigmatized in society.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the body size group is really informative because Trish is looking at a US context, and there people who are considered fat, obese, or overweight are about 75% of the population. So they're actually the majority, but it's a socially stigmatized group. And so we're trying to understand, how does that affect when you're thinking of a person? What body do you imagine?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess even like quantitatively, these like statistics of things don't necessarily capture these biases that we have, even if it's, about
It seems
50,
like it's
50
not
male,
just
female.
frequency.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. Because we have groups that are really large in size, like the body size groups,
Right.
like people who are overweight or fat, self-identify as fat. That's the much larger portion of the population. But when people are thinking of a person, they think of a thin person.
So like minority doesn't capture necessarily frequency.
That's right. It's also something to do with what is valued.
Right. Okay. So you've had like a lot of research that you've been doing that obviously says a lot about our society and our culture and our inherent biases that we hold. How is this like fed back to the public, or what do you feel like the implications for your research are in terms of, broader way we've been thinking about, everything and things going on in the world?
Yeah, I think to build up our kind of intuitions about how this might matter in our everyday lives, I'll talk about two kind of more silly examples first. I think that one way in which this matters, and you can see it, is when we're reasoning about different types of people. And you can see this when we're thinking about like solving a riddle. So there's this famous riddle, which some listeners might be aware of, which I will now briefly go through elegantly, which is that when there's like a man and his son, and they're driving in a car and they get in a car wreck, and the son is really injured, and so then they're rushing to the hospital, and they get to the hospital, and the surgeon goes to operate on the son, and the surgeon says, "I can't operate, this is my son." And this riddle is actually very hard for people to solve. If you've heard it before, you know the answer.
Yes, I remember this one.
Which is that the surgeon is
his mom.
The surgeon is the mom. But people really struggle to reach for this. And in fact, will go to the solution being that it's two gay dads before they will go to the solution that the surgeon is the son's mom.
Oh, really?
There's a recent paper by Kirsten Morehouse that really dug into this and showed that this bias still persists and disrupts people's ability to solve a really simple reasoning task.
Right.
And what I like about this too is that when you learn the solution, most people do not have a more kind of prototypically sexist reaction of the mom. No, a woman can't be a surgeon.
Yeah.
That's not how people react. They say, "Oh, right, of course."
Yeah.
And I think that really illustrates what we've been talking about, which is that what I'm most interested in is this phenomenon where it's not bad, there's no bad intentions, or sometimes there is, of course, but what I'm most interested in is the case where it's not bad intentioned. It's just that people's representation doesn't really include this category. And I'm talking about this surgeon case, which you might say, well, that's different because that's a male stereotypic context where men are overrepresented, and they are. Like empirically, there's more men in that role.
Yeah.
But this touches on some emerging work we've been doing as well, where we're looking at asymmetries in different occupations. So we find that people find it much harder to think of a female surgeon than they do, for instance, a male nurse. So we have different occupations that are matched in terms of the actual percent of men and women in the role, as well as perceived status of the role. And we find that, yes, of course, people think of women for nurses. Most nurses are women. And people think of men for surgeons.
Right.
Most surgeons are men. But they find it much easier to think of a male nurse and much harder to think of a female surgeon. And I think this illustrates it's important for us as psychologists who are interested in understanding gender stereotypes, but it also illustrates that there's this really basic underlying tendency of just who you're thinking of that makes it harder for women to enter male-dominated spaces than it does for men to enter equally female-dominated spaces.
Yeah. And I guess your work with Faisal as well, with you've got stuff going on in terms of like law and politics and how these biases have maybe like seeped into the edges of our lawmaking, and that's obviously very application
That's
based.
right.
Yeah.
And I think the work with Faisal is more in progress, so I don't want to overstate. But yeah, I think might also help us understand how kind of well-intentioned ways that we try to emphasize women in policies might ultimately backfire by still kind of cordoning them off to their own separate space and making it more different than just the policies that we have about people in general.
Yeah. So obviously we want to thank April Bailey for being here, and for all of you out there listening. We'll be back next month with a new episode. Please like, subscribe, and comment, whichever is most appropriate for the platform you're listening to this podcast on. And just a reminder that the full back catalog is available on all platforms.
Hello, producer Joe here. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe? We publish a new episode every month from October through to May. You can also find all of our previous episodes available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.